Hello, Coach Robert here with a new endgame video. Today we're going to be talking about the knight versus pawn endgame, which is one of the building blocks of more complex endgame situations. We'll start by looking at a couple of tactical motifs that arise in all the knight versus pawn scenarios, and then talk about a more advanced concept, which is a knight circuit, which is a way that a knight can dance around a pawn and control the promotion square and prevent the pawn from becoming a queen, which would be fatal, without any assistance from the king. So we'll start out with some basic cases, and we'll frame them as a puzzle. It's important to know what your goal is in this endgame. There's only one situation in which you can actually easily win with a minor piece like a knight against a pawn, and it's when the king's trapped. We'll look at that next. So usually we're playing for a draw, so you might want to pause here and see how you could easily secure a draw. The way is with a fork on the king and the pawn, because whatever move they play, like let's say they go here, we take the pawn, and this will be a draw by insufficient material. You cannot check them at just a king. They really need that pawn. So if we can just eliminate the pawn, we will secure a draw easily. That's the first thing that's important. There's one exceptional case where we're not really trying to get a draw, and it's when their king is trapped in front of the pawn and against the edge of the board. Here you might want to pause and see if you can solve this as a checkmate in 2 puzzle for white. It depends on the fact that their king is stuck on these 2 squares, and if you deprive them of this square, they will have to advance the pawn. Their king will be totally trapped. That would lead to a stalemate if you weren't able to give them a check, but luckily we can do that. They can only play this move, and now this is a smothered mate in the endgame. It's not the case that endgames are dry in tactics list, the way that people often say. There are lots of tactics in the endgame, which is why we have to start our endgame strategy lesson with some tactical review. Now here's our first example that's maybe complicated. First we're going to see an example in which we use another resource to make a draw before we talk about the circuits, and then we'll come back to this one later. So you might want to pause the video and see if you can figure out how white should secure a draw here by sacrificing the knight. There are 2 critical variations, but the one I want you to find first is just where you sacrifice the knight and get a draw that way. They want to promote their pawn like this, so we have to go here to head them off. Now let's say they just go ahead with their plan. They push the pawn. We have nothing better to do than bring our king close, and they want to chase our knight out, so they're going to follow this pattern. They're going to come in from behind. The reason they don't make a head-on approach is because of tactics, so you might want to pause here and see how white can secure a draw. It's with knight f1, so it's another fork. Just taking the pawn. No pawn, no win. So they're going to go this way. They don't really have any other options, because the knight is forming an effective barrier. They can't go here, here, or here, because if they go here it's tactics, and if they go on the other squares it's illegal, so they have to go around the barrier. So we keep bringing our king closer. At the critical moment we stand in front of the pawn, so we mechanically prevent it from promoting. And you might think all is lost here, but there is a stalemate resource. If you didn't get it on the first go, you could pause here and try again, but the answer is to run in and stick your king in their way, so they can't come out from in front of the pawn. That's a stalemate. So this is another technique that we will need in knight and pawn endgames in general. But let's talk about circuits. This first one's kind of basic. If white can select the right square among these 2, they will secure a draw, and if they pick the wrong one, they will lose. And this is contingent on them being able to obtain and maintain control of the square in front of the pawn, or otherwise capture the pawn. So that's your goal. If you want to pause the video and try to solve this on your own, choose between these 2, d3 or e2, and have a rationale as to why. Let's start with the incorrect answer, knight d3. This is incorrect because after king d2, knight c5, it looks like you're getting a draw, because if they play c1, they actually are losing their advantage, so you might want to pause here and see why c1 is bad. The answer is, if they make a queen, we get another fork, another pesky fork. So that would be very encouraging. You might just play this right away without thinking too hard once you see that, but it turns out that they can prevent you from playing this useful move, knight b3. So you might want to pause again, see if you can find the way that black will stop knight b3 and keep their advantage. The answer is king c3, so it controls both of these spots, and so the knight cannot get in touch with c1, so they lose. For example, if they give a check, it just doesn't really work. The king will just maneuver to a place where it still controls these 2 squares and also is not going to get in check. And there's no way to fork this light square and this dark square at the same time, so all hope is lost. So, coming back, that's why knight d3 is wrong for purely tactical reasons. But conceptually, it's that they failed to get into a good circuit, so I want to illustrate what that means. So, when your knight goes to e2, it's to the side of the pawn. This is an important pattern. Usually, we are going to try to control the promotion square from the side, not the rear, because this enables us to get into this cycle where they can only chase our knight away from one place, and when they do that, it just enables us to reposition for control in a different place. As you can see here, after the king moves, we can attack the pawn, and for tactical reasons they can't promote, as we saw in the other variation. And if they keep trying to chase us away, we just return to either b3 or e2 to control c1, or we just stand on c1 itself. So let's look at it more concretely. But this is the circuit. It's like a square shape, if you remember things visually like that, that has one corner to the side of the pawn, one behind diagonal to the pawn, and one in front of the pawn. You just complete the square like that. That's how you can remember what the circuit looks like. It's generally the same for different positions of the pawn. So let's say we play king d2, still logical. We play knight d4. Now here, if you weren't that tactically sharp, you would probably miss that after c1 queen, we can fork them. This is something you need to keep in mind. This is a critical resource. That's why I started by showing some tactical ideas. We need to keep in mind the tactics here. Now, if they don't promote, we just take the pawn. Like if they play king c3, we snag it. This is a critical difference compared to the other line. We can just take the pawn. We have a threat. Yeah, so this is kind of the whole thing. Now you might think this is not like a fantastic example because we don't get to see the knight traverse all the different squares. Maybe the circuit is not a useful concept. So let's revisit our previous diagram. Now after knight g3, and they play not h2 but king e3, we actually have to use the circuit to its greatest extent. So here's the idea. They play king e3 because they want to get in and prevent the knight from standing on these useful squares. You see how this is the same pattern as before, right? Like one square is to the side of the pawn. Well, f1 will be like to the side of where the pawn's advancing. One's in front of the pawn. One's behind diagonal to the pawn. So this is how the circuit always looks. And so they're trying to get in here and stop the knight from getting onto those good squares. Now you might want to pause here and see how you can secure the draw with this hint that we have to use the circuit. Probably my arrows just gave it away, but you know, it's good to think about it. Make sure you really understand. We start with knight f1 because this gets us into the path. All you have to double check is that you're not losing here. Like let's say you play knight h2, and they play, let's start with king g2 because they have options. So king g2, we go to g4, so we're still following this pattern. These are the squares that we said were critical. Now after king g3, they're trying to chase our knight away, and we return to the start of the circuit. So this is how you can just have an infinite loop where you always stop the promotion with tactics. Like here, if they try to advance, we immediately take it with that same fork that we've been seeing over and over again. Yeah, so we can just do this loop forever. We don't need our king to come in when they try this way of promoting the pawn. Now let's say they played king g3 right away. You might say, oh no, I can't play knight g4, that's terrible. Well, the circuit goes both ways. You know, like an electrical circuit has two directions to it. So we could go back to f1, and if they try to maintain control with like king g2, we just go back to e3, and it's the same pattern again. We can always return to g4 or f1 or h2. Knight e3 is the only square that might feel like intuitively tricky to choose because it looks like you're far away from the pawn. Most people feel like they need to like really hug close to the pawn to stop it, but the key is actually the circuit, this pattern that you can see here. This is what you need to remember if you want to reliably and easily draw against a single pawn, even under duress. Okay, so that's my video, and I hope you guys like it. If you do like it, check out my other stuff. I will be continuing my series on endgames. I'm hoping to make a somewhat comprehensive list of endgame videos that will build upon each other until we eventually reach queenless endgames with all the other pieces involved and many pawns. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Feel free to comment. You can join the Discord if you want. You just have to hit me up. Take care.